Hell's Angel gave his credit card to a poor girl to test her. What she did left him shocked. The winter wind whipped around Jack Reynolds as he stood on his weathered porch, watching snowflakes dance in the fading afternoon light. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, and he pulled his leather jacket tighter around his broad shoulders. The tattoos on his hands, visible despite the cold, told stories of a rougher past, one he'd left behind for this quiet life at the edge of town. His house stood like a sentinel against the white landscape, far enough from his nearest neighbors that their lights were mere pinpricks in the distance, just the way he liked it. No unexpected visitors, no small talk, no need to explain himself to anyone. The snow had been falling steadily since morning, coating everything in a thick blanket of white. Jack watched as it accumulated on the wooden railing, forming perfect little peaks that reminded him of frosted mountains. There was something peaceful about these moments. Just him, the quiet, and the endless fall of snow. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. His weathered face softened slightly as he observed a cardinal landing on a nearby tree branch, its red feathers a stark contrast against the monochrome landscape. These solitary moments were what he lived for now, far removed from the chaos and violence of his previous life. The isolation was his shield, protecting him from the complications that came with letting people get too close. The wind picked up, sending a shower of snow from the roof. Jack watched it swirl and settle, his mind drifting to memories he usually kept locked away. The rumble of motorcycles, the clash of fists, the betrayals, all part of a life he'd walked away from. Now, his days were marked by routine and silence, predictable and safe. He rubbed his bearded chin, feeling the familiar scratch of coarse hair against his calloused palm. The scars on his knuckles were barely visible in the dim light, but he knew everyone by heart. Each marked a moment when he'd chosen violence over understanding, strength over compassion. Those choices had left him here, alone, but at peace. Or so he told himself. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, and Jack could feel the cold seeping through his heavy boots. He took one last look at the pristine landscape, appreciating how the snow smoothed out all the rough edges of his property, making everything look clean and new. It was almost enough to make him believe in fresh starts. Just as he turned to head back inside, where a warm fire and his favorite chair waited, something caught his eye. There, huddled against the porch railing, was a small figure he hadn't noticed before. Jack blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, there really was a child there, a little girl no more than 8 years old, curled up in the snow. Her clothes were thin and worn, completely inadequate for the harsh weather. She looked up at him, with wide, uncertain eyes, her small frame shivering violently in the cold. Her dark hair was dusted with snow, and her lips had taken on a worrying bluish tinge. There was something in her expression, a mix of fear and hope, that made Jack's carefully constructed walls waver. She had a few bags with her, clutched tightly to her chest, as if they contained everything she owned in the world. The sight of her there, so vulnerable and alone, stirred something in Jack that he thought he'd buried long ago, a flicker of concern, an unwanted urge to protect. Jack stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing with questions. The little girl continued to shiver, her teeth chattering audibly in the cold winter air. His first instinct was caution. Years of life in a biker gang had taught him that things weren't always what they seemed. But there was something about her vulnerable state that pushed through his defenses. He took a careful step forward, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. "Hey there," he said, trying to soften his naturally gruff voice. What are you doing out here?" The girl looked up at him, her small face pinched with cold. Despite her obvious fear, she met his eyes directly. "I'm looking for my mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been sick, and I can't find her." Jack shifted his weight, unconsciously making himself appear less intimidating. "What's your name?" "Maddie," she replied, clutching her bags tighter to her chest. They were worn and patched, speaking of hard times and careful mending. "I'm Jack," he said, crouching down to her level, though still maintaining some distance. "Where did you come from, Maddie? It's not safe for a kid to be out alone in this weather." Her lower lip trembled slightly. "I don't know exactly where I am. I've been walking for a while, trying to find help." She sniffled, wiping her nose with a threadbare sleeve. "Mom's been really sick. I didn't know what else to do." Jack ran a hand through his beard, weighing his options. Every instinct from his past life screamed at him to stay uninvolved, to call the authorities and let them handle it. But the temperature was dropping rapidly, and the girl's lips were taking on an even darker shade of blue. "Listen," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "It's too cold out here. Why don't you come inside where it's warm? We can sort this out properly there." Maddie hesitated, looking at his tattooed hands and leather jacket. Jack could see the internal struggle on her face, the warning every child receives about strangers fighting against her desperate need for warmth and help. "I've got some hot soup on the stove," he added, surprising himself with the offer. He didn't usually cook for anyone but himself. After a moment's consideration, Maddie nodded, slowly getting to her feet. Her movements were stiff from the cold, and she stumbled slightly. Jack resisted the urge to help her up, knowing his touch might frighten her. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them. Jack's kitchen was simple but clean, with a worn wooden table and mismatched chairs. He gestured for Maddie to sit while he moved to the stove, where a pot of soup had been simmering. As he ladled the hot liquid into a bowl, he watched her from the corner of his eye. She sat quietly, her bags still held close, taking in her surroundings with a wariness that seemed too old for her years. Her clothes, now visible in the kitchen light, were clean but well worn, speaking of someone who took care with what little they had. Jack placed the steaming bowl in front of her, along with a spoon and some crackers. "Careful, it's hot," he warned, sitting down across from her. As Maddie began to eat, small hands wrapped gratefully around the warm bowl, Jack found himself wondering what circumstances had led this child to his doorstep. What kind of desperate situation would drive a young girl to wander alone in the snow, seeking help from strangers? Maddie stirred her soup slowly, her small fingers wrapped tightly around the warm spoon. "Mom works really hard," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "She has 2 jobs. Well, she did before the accident." Jack leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the worn kitchen table. "What kind of accident?" he asked, trying to keep his voice gentle. "She fell at the diner where she works nights. The floor was wet, and she slipped really bad." Maddie's face scrunched up with worry. "The doctors said something about her back. She's been in the hospital for 3 days now." Jack felt something twist in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation he hadn't experienced in years. The girl's simple honesty and obvious concern for her mother struck a chord he thought had long since gone silent. "Your mom's name is Sarah?" he asked, his throat suddenly dry. Maddie nodded, spooning up more soup. "Sarah Mitchell. She's the best mom ever. She always makes sure I have enough to eat, even when she's tired, from working." Her eyes grew distant. "Sometimes she doesn't eat much herself, but she says she's just not hungry." Jack's hands, rough from years of working on motorcycles, clenched involuntarily under the table. He recognized the signs of a parent going hungry to feed their child. His own mother had done the same thing years ago, though he'd been too young to understand it then. "The hospital's really big," Maddie continued, breaking a cracker into tiny pieces. "I tried to find it again, but everything looks different in the snow. Mom always says to ask for help when you need it, so—" She gestured vaguely at his house. The trust in her eyes made Jack uncomfortable. He was used to people crossing the street to avoid him, to suspicious glances and whispered comments. This child's open honesty felt foreign, almost dangerous. "How do you know you can trust me?" he asked gruffly. "I could be anybody." Maddie looked at him thoughtfully, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. "Mom says you can usually tell good people by their eyes. Your eyes look sad, but not mean." Jack shifted in his chair, unsettled by her perception. He watched as she finished the last of her soup, carefully wiping her mouth with the paper napkin he'd provided. Her manners were impeccable, speaking of careful teaching despite difficult circumstances. A thought formed in his mind. A test, perhaps cruel, but necessary for his peace of mind. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a credit card. "There's a store about 2 blocks down," he said, sliding the card across the table. "Why don't you go get some food? Whatever you think you need." Maddie's eyes widened as she looked at the card. Are you sure?" Jack nodded, his face stern. "Consider it a test. You can take the card and run, buy whatever you want, or you can prove you're telling me the truth about needing help." He paused, feeling the weight of his next words. "Show me what kind of person you really are." The words felt harsh even as he spoke them, but years of betrayal had taught him to be cautious. He watched as Maddie carefully picked up the credit card, holding it like it might break. "The store's that way," he said, pointing through his front window. "You can't miss it. It's the only one open on this street." Jack stood at his living room window, hands pressed against the cold glass, as he watched Maddie's small figure trudge through the snow. Her footprints left a delicate trail behind her, each step careful and measured in the fresh powder. The credit card he'd given her, his test of trust, was clutched tightly in her mittened hand. "What was I thinking?" he muttered, his breath fogging the window. Years of experience had taught him that people couldn't be trusted, that everyone had an angle. He'd seen too many betrayals, too many friends turn their backs when things got tough. And here he was, handing his credit card to a complete stranger. A child. No, less. His weathered fingers drummed against the windowsill as he watched her disappear around the corner. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to call the bank, to cancel the card before she could do any damage. It would be so easy for her to buy whatever she wanted, to take advantage of his moment of weakness. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one feeling longer than the last. Jack paced his living room, his heavy boots leaving marks in the carpet. He checked his phone repeatedly, expecting a flood of fraud alerts from his bank. But nothing came. Through the window, he could see the sky darkening, the snowfall growing heavier. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pristine white ground. His worry shifted from his finances to the girl herself. Was she lost? Cold? Should he go looking for her? Just as he reached for his jacket, a movement caught his eye. There, emerging from the swirling snow, was Maddie's small figure. She walked carefully, holding a single brown paper bag close to her chest. Jack's heart pounded as he watched her navigate the slippery path back to his porch. The doorbell rang, its chime echoing through the quiet house. Jack opened the door, trying to keep his face neutral despite the relief flooding through him. Maddie stood there, her cheeks pink from the cold, snowflakes melting in her hair. "Here's your card back, Mr. Reynolds," she said, holding it out to him. Her other arm cradled the small grocery bag. "Thank you for trusting me with it." Jack took the card wordlessly, examining it as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. Maddie set the bag on his porch and began pulling out items: a loaf of bread, a small jar of peanut butter, some fruit, and a half-gallon of milk. "I only got what we really need," she explained, arranging the items carefully. "Mom always says we shouldn't take more than necessary, especially when someone's being kind." She looked up at him, her eyes sincere. "The lady at the store helped me pick things that would last a while." Jack stared at the modest collection of groceries, then at the little girl standing proudly on his porch. His throat felt tight, and for once in his life, he found himself completely speechless. All his cynicism, all his carefully constructed walls of mistrust seemed to crumble in the face of such simple, pure honesty. The receipt fluttered in the wind, still tucked into the brown paper bag. Jack caught a glimpse of the total: less than $20. He'd given her access to thousands, and she'd bought only what she needed to survive. Jack slumped into his worn leather armchair, the credit card still between his calloused fingers. The leather of the chair creaked as he shifted, his eyes fixed on the modest collection of groceries Maddie had carefully arranged on his coffee table. Each item seemed to mock his cynicism: the simple loaf of bread, the jar of peanut butter, the fresh fruit that couldn't have cost more than a few dollars. "You really didn't take anything extra," he said, more to himself than to Maddie. His voice was gruff with emotion he couldn't quite place. Maddie sat cross-legged on the floor, her small hands folded in her lap. The warmth of the house had brought color back to her cheeks, but her clothes still looked thin and worn. "Mom always says being honest is more important than having things." Jack rubbed his beard, studying the little girl. There was something about her, a quiet wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. His heart, hardened by years of disappointment and betrayal, felt strange in his chest, like it was trying to remember how to feel something other than suspicion. "Your mom," he started, clearing his throat. "You said she's sick? Where is she now?" Maddie's shoulders drooped slightly, and her fingers played with a loose thread on her sleeve. "She's in the hospital. She had an accident at work, at the diner where she works late shifts. The doctors said she needs to stay there for a while." "Which hospital?" Jack asked, leaning forward in his chair. Something about the way Maddie described her mother's situation made his stomach twist uncomfortably. "St. Mary's," Maddie replied, her voice small. "She's been there for 3 days now. I've been staying with our neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, but she had to go visit her sister today, and I didn't want to be alone, and—" She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. St. Mary's. The same hospital where Sarah, his Sarah, the one he'd known since they were teenagers, had been admitted after her accident at work. The Sarah he'd abandoned years ago when his life had taken a dark turn, when the bike gang had become his new family. "Your mother," he said, his mouth suddenly dry. "What's her name?" Maddie looked up at him, her eyes bright and innocent. "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell." The credit card slipped from Jack's fingers, landing silently on the carpet. The room seemed to spin around him as memories crashed through the carefully constructed walls in his mind. Sarah's laugh during summer afternoons spent by the lake. Her disappointed face the last time he'd seen her, when he'd chosen the gang over their friendship. The news he'd heard through the grapevine about her struggles as a single mother. And now here was her daughter, sitting on his floor, having shown more integrity in one simple act than he had in years of running away from his past. The guilt hit him like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. All these years, Sarah had been in the same town, working herself to exhaustion to provide for her daughter, while he'd hidden away in his isolated house, nursing his own wounds and ignoring the world. He stared at Maddie, really seeing her for the first time. She had Sarah's eyes, he realized, the same gentle, determined look that had once made him believe he could be a better person. Jack sat at his kitchen table, the old wood scarred with years of use. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten, as memories of Sarah washed over him like waves. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, but his mind was lost in the past, 20 years ago. He remembered Sarah's smile, how it could light up even the darkest days. They'd spent countless afternoons at Pete's diner, sharing fries and dreams. Sarah had always ordered the same thing, a chocolate shake and sweet potato fries. She'd dip the fries in the shake, laughing at his disgusted face. "That's just wrong," he'd always tell her, but she'd just grin and do it anyway. His hands tightened around the coffee mug. Sarah had been the one constant in his life back then, before everything went sideways. When his parents split up, she'd been there, sitting with him on his front porch until the sun went down. When he got his first motorcycle, she'd been the first to climb on the back, trusting him completely despite her fear of fast vehicles. The memory of her trust made his chest ache. She'd believed in him, even when he stopped believing in himself. Even when the gang started taking up more of his time, when the rides became less about freedom and more about proving something. Sarah had tried to reach him, to pull him back from the edge. "You're better than this, Jack," she'd said one night, standing in the rain outside his apartment. "This isn't you." But he hadn't listened. He'd chosen the gang, the artificial family that demanded loyalty through fear rather than love. He'd pushed her away, convinced himself it was for her own good. The things he was involved in, they weren't safe for someone like Sarah, someone who still saw good in everything. Jack's fingers traced a deep groove in the table's surface. He remembered the last time he'd seen her, really seen her, not just glimpses around town. She'd been working at the supermarket, trying to make ends meet. He'd turned and walked the other way, too ashamed to face her. That was 5 years ago, and now here was her daughter, sitting in his kitchen, showing the same kind heart that Sarah had always had. The same unwavering belief in doing what was right, even when life was hard. How had Sarah managed to raise such a good kid while struggling so much? And where had he been all this time? "Mr. Reynolds?" Maddie's small voice cut through his thoughts. "Are you okay? You look sad?" Jack blinked, startled back to the present moment. Maddie was watching him with concerned eyes, her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate he'd made for her earlier. The sight of her genuine worry for him, a stranger who had only shown her basic kindness, made his throat tight. He started, his voice rough. "I used to know your mother, Maddie. A long time ago." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of regret and missed opportunities. Maddie didn't respond, but her eyes widened slightly with understanding. They sat there in silence, the kitchen clock continuing its steady rhythm, marking time in a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Jack paced his living room, his heavy boots wearing a path in the old carpet. Every few minutes, he'd glance at Maddie, who had fallen asleep on his worn leather couch. He'd draped his softest blanket over her small frame, and now she looked peaceful, unburdened by the weight of her worries. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room. Jack ran his hand through his graying beard, his mind racing with thoughts of Sarah. How many times had he driven past that diner where she worked, never stopping to say hello? How many chances had he missed to make things right? He remembered the last Christmas they'd spent together, before everything fell apart. Sarah had saved up for weeks to buy him a leather wallet, which he still kept in his dresser drawer, unused. He'd been too caught up in his new life with the gang to get her anything. The memory made his stomach turn. Maddie stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about her mother. Jack's chest tightened. This little girl needed her mom, and Sarah needed help. He couldn't hide in his house anymore, pretending the past didn't exist. Moving to his bedroom, Jack pulled on his heavy winter coat. He checked his wallet, making sure he had enough cash for cab fare and whatever else might come up. In the kitchen, he scribbled a note for Maddie in case she woke up while he was gone. "Gone to find your mom. Stay warm. Jack." The girl's honesty with his credit card earlier kept playing in his mind. Such a simple act of integrity, just like her mother would have done. Sarah had always been straight as an arrow, even when times were tough. Now her daughter was the same way. Jack looked around his house, really seeing it for the first time in years. The empty rooms, the silence, the loneliness he'd convinced himself he preferred. What had isolation really given him except more regrets? He walked back to the living room and gently shook Maddie awake. Her eyes fluttered open, confused for a moment before focusing on his face. "Hey, kid," he said softly. "I'm going to the hospital to find your mom. You want to come with me?" Maddie sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Really? You'll help find her?" "Yeah," Jack nodded, his voice gruff with emotion. "I should have done it a long time ago." He helped Maddie into her tattered coat, then paused. Without hesitation, he went to his closet and pulled out a smaller coat he'd kept from years ago. It was his niece's, left behind during a rare family visit. He'd never gotten around to returning it. "Here," he said, holding it out to Maddie. "This'll keep you warmer than that thin thing you've got." Maddie's eyes lit up as she slipped on the coat. It was a little big, but it was warm and clean. She hugged herself, smiling up at Jack with pure gratitude. Jack grabbed his keys, then stopped. No, the roads were too slick with snow. They'd take a cab instead. Safer that way, opening his front door. Jack stepped out into the swirling snow. The wind had picked up, creating white swirls that danced in the dying light. He turned back to look at Maddie, who stood on his porch, clutching her new coat around her. She looked small against the backdrop of falling snow, but there was something in her expression, a hint of hope that made Jack stand a little straighter. He was going to make things right, no matter what it took. The automatic doors of St. Mary's Hospital slid open with a soft hiss, releasing a burst of warm air into the cold evening. Jack stepped inside, his boots leaving wet marks on the polished floor. Maddie stayed close to his side, her small hand clutching the edge of his leather jacket. The hospital's bright fluorescent lights made his tattoos stand out stark against his skin, drawing curious glances from the people in the waiting room. The antiseptic smell brought back memories Jack had tried to forget. The last time he'd been in a hospital was after a particularly bad motorcycle accident. That had been the turning point, when he'd decided to leave the gang life behind. But it had also been when he'd pushed Sarah away, along with everyone else who cared about him. They approached the front desk, where a middle-aged receptionist looked up from her computer screen. Her eyes widened slightly at Jack's appearance, but her professional demeanor didn't waver. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice pleasant but guarded. Jack cleared his throat. "I'm looking for Sarah." He paused, realizing he didn't even know if she still used her maiden name. She was brought in after an accident at the diner where she works. The receptionist's fingers moved across her keyboard. "Are you family?" "He's a friend," Maddie piped up before Jack could answer. "He knows my mom from before." The receptionist's expression softened as she looked at Maddie. "Oh, you're Sarah's little girl. She's been asking about you, sweetheart." Relief washed over Maddie's face. Jack felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. At least Sarah was conscious and talking. "Room 342, the receptionist said, writing the number on a small slip of paper. "Third floor, East Wing. Visiting hours end at 8. Jack nodded his thanks, taking the paper. He and Maddie found the elevator, stepping inside with an elderly couple who smiled warmly at them. Jack noticed how the woman's eyes crinkled at the corners when she saw Maddie in her oversized coat, probably assuming they were father and daughter. The thought made something twist in his chest. The elevator dinged at the 3rd floor, and they stepped out into a quieter hallway. Their footsteps were muffled by the carpeted floor as they followed the signs toward the East Wing. The room numbers ticked by. 338, 340, 341. They reached 342, and Jack stopped. Through the partially open door, he could hear the steady beep of monitors and the soft murmur of a television. Maddie took a step forward, but Jack gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Wait here a minute, kid," he said softly. "Let me talk to your mom first." Maddie nodded, understanding in her young eyes. She sat down in one of the chairs lining the hallway, her feet barely touching the floor. Jack stood before the door, his heart hammering in his chest. What would Sarah think when she saw him? Would she be angry? Would she tell him to leave? He wouldn't blame her if she did. He'd disappeared from her life without a word, too caught up in his own darkness to think about how it might affect her. A soft cough came from inside the room, followed by the rustle of sheets. Jack took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He'd faced down rival gang members without flinching, but this, facing up to his past mistakes, was harder than anything he'd ever done. With hands that weren't quite steady, he raised his fist and knocked gently on the door. The hospital room was dim, lit only by the fading evening light through half-drawn curtains and the soft glow of medical monitors. Sarah lay propped up against white pillows, her dark hair a stark contrast against the sterile bedding. An IV line snaked from her arm to a bag hanging beside the bed, and the steady beep of the heart monitor marked time like a metronome. Jack stood in the doorway, frozen. The Sarah he remembered had been full of life, always quick with a smile or a kind word. This Sarah looked worn down, as if life had slowly chipped away at her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and fine lines marked the corners of her mouth, lines that spoke of worry and hardship rather than laughter. But when she turned her head at the sound of his entrance, Jack saw that her eyes were the same. They still held that gentle warmth he remembered, though now it was clouded with something else: pain, exhaustion, and a depth of hurt that made his chest tighten. Sarah's fingers clutched at the thin hospital blanket as recognition dawned on her face. Her mouth opened, slightly, but no words came out. The steady beeping of the heart monitor quickened just slightly. Jack took a hesitant step into the room, his boots suddenly feeling too heavy, too loud on the linoleum floor. The leather of his jacket creaked as he shifted his weight, and the sound seemed to echo in the silence between them. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat had closed up tight. The years stretched between them like a physical thing, filled with all the words they'd never said, all the moments they'd missed. Jack thought of all the times he could have reached out, could have checked on her, could have been there when she needed someone. Instead, he'd hidden away in his house, building walls around himself brick by brick, until he'd forgotten why he'd started building them in the first place. Sarah's gaze traveled over him, taking in the new tattoos that snaked up his neck, the gray in his beard that hadn't been there before, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against the wind on long motorcycle rides. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands had relaxed their grip on the blanket. Outside the room, footsteps passed in the hallway. A cart rattled by. Somewhere, a phone rang at the nurse's station. But in the room, time seemed suspended, caught between past and present, between what was and what could have been. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but each word carried the weight of years behind it. "Where were you, Jack?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass. Jack opened his mouth, then closed it again. How could he explain the darkness that had consumed him, the fear that had driven him away from everyone who cared about him, the years he'd wasted thinking he was protecting others by staying away? None of it seemed to matter now, standing here in this hospital room, seeing the result of his absence written in the tired lines of Sarah's face. Words wouldn't come. He stood there, speechless, as the monitors continued their steady beeping, marking each moment of silence between them. The silence stretched between them like a rubber band ready to snap. Jack shifted his weight, the old vinyl chair beneath him creaking in protest. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Sarah's face. "I trusted you," Sarah said, her voice stronger now, edged with years of hurt. "We all did. And then one day, you just disappeared." She turned her head to look out the window, where snow was still falling in lazy spirals. "No goodbye, no explanation. Nothing." Jack's hands clenched in his lap. The guilt that had been building since he'd seen Maddie on his porch now felt like a physical weight on his chest. "I thought I was protecting everyone," he said, the words coming out rough and inadequate. "The crowd I was running with. Things were getting dangerous." Sarah's laugh was bitter, nothing like the warm sound he remembered from their younger days. "Protecting us? By leaving us wondering if you were dead in a ditch somewhere?" Her voice cracked slightly. "Do you know how many times I drove past your house, trying to work up the courage to knock on your door?" The monitor's steady beeping filled another stretch of silence. Jack watched as Sarah pressed her lips together, fighting back emotions he could see building behind her eyes. "I needed you," she continued, softer now. "When Tom left, when I found out I was pregnant with Maddie, I had no one to turn to. Your house was right there, but you might as well have been on the moon." Each word hit Jack like a physical blow. He remembered the lights he'd seen passing his house late at night, how he'd always drawn the curtains tighter, convinced his isolation was for the best. "Sarah, Don't," she cut him off, holding up one hand. "Just don't. I don't want apologies. They won't change anything now." She closed her eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "I've spent too many years being angry at you, Jack. I'm too tired to hold on to it anymore." The medical machines continued their electronic vigil as Sarah's words hung in the air. Outside in the hallway, a nurse's shoes squeaked against the floor as she passed by. "Things have been hard," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "This accident, I was working double shifts at the diner trying to make ends meet. Maddie's been so brave through all of it, but she's just a child." Sarah's fingers twisted in the thin hospital blanket. "The medical bills keep coming. I can't work, can't pay rent, can't even take care of my own daughter right now." Jack watched as a tear slid down Sarah's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, as if angry at herself for showing weakness. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she admitted, staring down at her hands. "Every day I'm in here, the bills get bigger. Maddie needs new clothes, school supplies." Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be dumping all this on you. It's not your problem." Something fierce and protective stirred in Jack's chest as he listened to Sarah's words. The woman who had once been the strongest person he knew now looked so vulnerable, so overwhelmed. His jaw tightened as he thought of Maddie, of her simple honesty with his credit card, of how she was bearing burdens no child should have to carry. Jack stepped out of the hospital into the biting cold, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the parking lot. His breath came out in white puffs as he walked to his truck, his mind racing with everything Sarah had told him. The image of her lying in that hospital bed, trying to be strong despite everything, wouldn't leave him. He remembered the Sarah from years ago. Fierce, independent, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand. Now here she was, drowning in medical bills while her daughter wandered the streets alone in winter. Jack climbed into his truck but didn't start it right away. Instead, he sat there, letting the cold seep into his bones as he thought about what he could do. His own savings wouldn't make much of a dent in hospital bills this size, but he had other resources, connections he'd tried to forget about, people who still owed him favors from his wilder days. The leather of the steering wheel creaked under his tight grip. He'd spent years avoiding those old contacts, determined to leave that life behind. But now, those connections might be exactly what Sarah and Maddie needed. Back at his house, Jack shed his heavy coat and sat down at his kitchen table. His old address book lay before him, its leather cover cracked and worn. He hadn't opened it in years, but he'd never been able to throw it away either. Inside were names and numbers from his past, fellow bikers, mechanics, bar owners, people who'd been there during the darkest times of his life. Jack flipped through the yellowed pages, his calloused finger stopping at a familiar name. Mike Big Money Thompson. Mike had done well for himself over the years, turning his auto shop into a successful chain. He also owed Jack for keeping him out of serious trouble back in '98. The phone felt heavy in Jack's hand as he dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah? Mike? It's Jack Reynolds." There was a long pause on the other end. "Hells? Man, I haven't heard from you in what, 10 years?" "Something like that," Jack replied, running a hand through his beard. "Listen, I need to call in that favor you owe me." "Straight to business, huh?" Mike chuckled. "Some things never change. What do you need?" Jack took a deep breath. "I need to borrow 50 grand. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "That's a lot of cash, Hells," Mike finally said. "What's it for?" "Medical bills, for—" Jack paused, the words sticking in his throat. "For an old friend. Someone I let down a long time ago." "Sarah Miller?" Mike asked, surprising Jack. "Yeah, I heard about the accident. Small town, word gets around." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. "Can you help?" Another long pause. Jack could practically hear Mike thinking it over. "I can do 25, Mike said finally. "It'll clean me out, but I can do it. When do you need it?" Jack closed his eyes, relief washing over him. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. "As soon as possible." "I'll have it tomorrow," Mike said. "And Hells, good to hear from you, man. Really." Jack hung up the phone and stared at the address book. One call down, many more to go. He'd need to reach out to everyone he knew, ask for more than he was comfortable asking. But looking at the old names, he knew he'd do whatever it took to help Sarah and Maddie. The next few days blurred together for Jack as he worked his way through his old address book. His kitchen table became command central, covered with scraps of paper showing names, numbers, and dollar amounts. Empty coffee cups littered the surface, testament to his long hours of calls. Some conversations were brief and painful. "Sorry, Hells, can't help you," became a familiar refrain. Others hung up as soon as they heard his voice. Each rejection stung, reminding Jack of bridges he'd burned years ago. "Listen, Jack," said Tommy Peters, an old riding buddy. "Last time I saw you, you were threatening to break my jaw over a bike part. Why should I help you now?" Jack rubbed his temples, fighting back frustration. "I know I messed up, Tommy. I was different back then. But this isn't for me. It's for Sarah Miller and her kid." "Sarah Miller?" Tommy's voice softened slightly. "Always liked her. She's still making those amazing apple pies?" "She's in the hospital, Tommy. Bad accident. Bills are piling up." The line went quiet for a moment. "I can spare 200, Tommy finally said. "It's not much, but it's what I got." Jack wrote the amount down on his growing list. "Thanks, Tommy. I mean it." By the third day, Jack's voice was hoarse from talking. He'd managed to secure promises for about $30,000. Still not enough. His own savings would add another 10, but it wouldn't cover all of Sarah's medical expenses. Late that afternoon, while Jack was heating up a can of soup, his phone rang. The number wasn't one he recognized. "Yeah?" he answered, stirring the soup with his free hand. "That you, Hells?" The voice was familiar, but Jack couldn't place it right away. "Who's asking?" "It's Charlie Mason. Remember me? You saved my hide in that bar fight in Denver?" Jack's spoon clattered against the pot as memory clicked into place. Charlie Mason had been a prospect in their club, just a kid, really, when some out-of-town bikers had jumped him. Jack had waded in, taken more than a few hits himself, but made sure Charlie got out okay. "Charlie," Jack said slowly. "Yeah, I remember. Heard you moved out west." "I did. Made some good investments, too. Word's getting around about what you're doing for Sarah Miller." Jack leaned against his counter, suddenly tired. "News travels fast." "Always does," Charlie agreed. "Listen, I owe you my life from that night in Denver. Never got a chance to really pay you back. I heard you're trying to raise money for hospital bills?" "That's right." "I can help with that. How does 50,000 sound?" Jack nearly dropped the phone. "What?" 50,000, Charlie repeated. "I can wire it tomorrow morning. Just need the account details." Jack's hands shook as he grabbed a pen. This was more than he'd hoped for from any single person. Combined with what he'd already raised, it would cover the majority of Sarah's bills. "Charlie, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just make sure Sarah gets the help she needs. And Hells, it's good to hear you're doing something. Like this. Shows people can change." After getting the wire transfer details sorted out, Jack hung up the phone. He stared at his list of numbers, adding Charlie's contribution to the total. They were getting close now, but there was still a gap to fill. Tomorrow would bring more calls, more asking for help. But for the first time since starting this mission, Jack felt like they might actually make it. Jack walked through the hospital corridors, his boots squeaking against the polished floor. The envelope in his jacket pocket felt heavy with promise. Not just the paperwork showing the pledged donations, but the weight of possibility it carried. For the first time in days, his shoulders felt lighter despite his lack of sleep. Room 412 was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. Sarah lay propped up against white pillows, her face drawn and tired, but her eyes were open. She turned her head slightly as Jack entered, and he noticed she looked paler than during his last visit. "Hey," he said softly, pulling up the familiar plastic chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling today?" Sarah managed a weak smile. "Been better. The doctors say the infection's making things complicated." She paused, studying his face. "You look like you haven't slept." "Been busy," Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope. His rough hands, more used to working on motorcycles than handling paperwork, carefully removed the documents. "I've been making some calls, Sarah, talking to people who owed me favors." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What kind of calls?" "Good ones." Jack spread the papers on her blanket-covered lap. "I've managed to raise quite a bit of money. Charlie Mason, remember him? The kid from Denver? He's putting in $50,000. Tommy Peters, some others too. With my savings added in, we're getting close to covering your bills." Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the numbers. "Jack, Her voice cracked. "I don't know what to say. This is—" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't have to say anything." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd never been good with emotional moments. "Just focus on getting better. Maddie needs you back home." "Maddie," Sarah whispered. "How is she?" "She's staying with me. She's tough, just like her mom. Made friends with the neighbor's cat." Jack smiled slightly. "She's doing okay, Sarah. I promise." Sarah reached out and grabbed Jack's hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her weakness. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for looking after her. For this." She gestured at the papers with her free hand. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the beeping monitors providing a steady backdrop. Sarah's eyes started to droop, and Jack could see she was fighting to stay awake. "Get some rest," he said, standing up. "I'll come back tomorrow." Sarah nodded, already drifting off. Jack tucked the papers into the drawer beside her bed and quietly left the room. In the hallway, he pulled out his phone to check on Maddie. His neighbor had agreed to watch her while he visited Sarah. As he walked toward the elevator, his phone rang. The hospital's number flashed on the screen. "Mr. Reynolds?" A professional voice spoke as soon as he answered. "This is Dr. Martinez from Memorial Hospital. I'm calling about Sarah Miller." Jack stopped walking, his hand tightening on the phone. "What's wrong?" "I'm afraid there's been a complication. The infection we've been treating has spread more aggressively than we anticipated. She's going to need additional procedures and an extended stay." The doctor paused. "The estimated costs will be significantly higher than our initial assessment." Jack leaned against the wall, feeling as if the floor had dropped out from under him. All the progress, all the favors called in, suddenly seemed inadequate. "How much more?" he managed to ask, his voice rough. The doctor quoted a number that made Jack's head spin. Everything he'd accomplished in the past few days crumbled around him. He ended the call mechanically, barely registering the doctor's sympathetic goodbye. Jack's boots felt like lead as he trudged through the snow toward his house. The setting sun cast long shadows across the pristine white ground, but he barely noticed the beauty around him. His mind raced with numbers that didn't add up, with promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Inside, the house was warm and smelled like chocolate chip cookies. His elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, looked up from where she sat at the kitchen table with Maddie. "We did some baking," Mrs. Peterson said with a gentle smile. "Maddie's quite the helper." Jack tried to force a smile, but couldn't quite manage it. He nodded instead, shrugging off his leather jacket and hanging it by the door. His shoulders felt heavy, like they were carrying the weight of all his past mistakes. "Thanks for watching her," he muttered. Mrs. Peterson seemed to sense his mood and quietly gathered her things, patting his arm as she left. Maddie sat at the table, her small legs swinging, crumbs from the cookies dotting the table around her. "Did you see Mommy today?" she asked, her eyes bright with hope. Jack slumped into a chair across from her. "Yeah, kiddo, I did." He ran a hand through his graying beard, trying to find the right words. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes your best isn't good enough? The silence stretched between them as Jack stared at his rough, calloused hands. Hands that had done so many wrong things in his life. He'd pushed people away, burned bridges, lived selfishly. Now, when he finally wanted to do something right, it felt like the universe was laughing at him. "You look sad," Maddie observed, pushing a cookie toward him. "Cookies help when you're sad." Jack looked at the slightly burnt cookie, then at Maddie's earnest face. His throat tightened. Sometimes grown-ups face problems that cookies can't fix," he said quietly. "Is it about Mommy's hospital bills?" Maddie asked, surprising him with her perception. Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, the doctors say she needs more treatment than we thought. It's going to cost—" He trailed off, realizing he was talking to a child. "It's going to be hard to help her the way we want to." "But you're still going to try, right?" Maddie's voice was small but steady. Jack looked away, unable to meet her trusting gaze. "I don't know if I can do enough, kiddo. Sometimes things are just too big for one person to fix." Maddie was quiet for a moment, thoughtfully nibbling on another cookie. Then she said, "Mommy always says that kindness is never wasted, even when it's hard." She looked at Jack with those wise eyes that seemed too old for her young face. "She says that trying to help is what matters, even if you can't fix everything." Jack felt something crack inside his chest. Here was this little girl who had every reason to be scared and bitter, sharing wisdom that put his adult fears to shame. He reached across the table and took the cookie she'd offered earlier. "Your mom's pretty smart, you know that?" he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Maddie nodded solemnly. "That's why we have to help her get better." Looking at her determined little face, Jack felt his doubt begin to shift. Maybe he couldn't fix everything, but giving up wasn't an option. Not when this little girl still believed in him. Not when Sarah needed him. For the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Jack sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers and phone numbers. His leather jacket hung forgotten on the chair, and his usually stern face was creased with concentration. He'd been making calls all morning, his voice growing hoarse from explaining Sarah's situation over and over. "Yes, ma'am," he said into the phone, trying to keep his gruff voice gentle. "The fundraiser would be at the community center. Any donation would help." He scribbled another note on his growing list. Mrs. Thompson from the bakery had agreed to provide cookies and pastries. Maddie watched from across the table, coloring quietly in a notebook. She'd been making posters for the event, her childish handwriting spelling out, "Help my mommy get better," in rainbow colors. The sight of those posters made Jack's throat tight every time he looked at them. "Thank you, really appreciate it," he said, ending another call. He rubbed his tired eyes and looked at his list. The local diner had agreed to cater, the hardware store was donating supplies, and even the high school band had volunteered to perform. "How many people are coming?" Maddie asked, looking up from her coloring. "More than I expected, kiddo," Jack admitted. He was surprised by how many people had responded to his calls. The same community that had once whispered about his biker, past was now stepping up to help. It felt strange, like a wall he'd built around himself was slowly crumbling. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. Jack found himself doing things he never thought he would, hanging streamers in the community center, arranging chairs, coordinating with volunteers. His old biker friends even showed up to help, their leather jackets and tattoos a stark contrast to the cheerful decorations they were putting up. "Never thought I'd see you organizing a bake sale, Hells," one of them joked, helping him set up tables. Jack just shrugged, but he couldn't help smiling a little. "People change," he said simply. The morning of the fundraiser arrived cold and clear. Jack stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his clean, button-down shirt. He hardly recognized himself. He'd trimmed his beard and even attempted to tame his usually wild hair. His hands shook slightly as he buttoned the cuffs. Maddie appeared in the doorway, wearing her best dress. "You look nice," she said, smiling up at him. "Thanks, kiddo." He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "Ready to go?" At the community center, people were already gathering. The parking lot was filling up with cars, and the smell of coffee and baked goods wafted through the air. Jack's stomach churned as he watched more people arrive. He'd never been good at public speaking, but today he'd have to address the crowd. Tables lined the walls, loaded with donated items for the silent auction. The high school band was setting up in one corner, their instruments gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Volunteers bustled around, pinning up Maddie's colorful posters and arranging donation boxes. As the crowd grew, Jack felt his anxiety rising. These people had all come because he'd asked them to, because they wanted to help Sarah. The responsibility felt enormous. He stood near the makeshift stage, his speech notes crumpled in his sweating palm. The room was nearly full now, a sea of familiar faces from around town. The band director caught his eye and nodded. It was time to start. Jack took another deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The microphone waited for him, and as he approached it, the crowd began to quiet. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting to hear what the former biker had to say. The hospital corridor felt different today, as Jack walked toward Sarah's room. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed softer somehow, and the antiseptic smell didn't burn his nostrils quite as much. His footsteps echoed against the linoleum floor, each step lighter than before. He carried a small potted plant, nothing fancy, just some purple flowers Maddie had helped him pick out. The fundraiser's success still buzzed in his mind. The community had shown up in force, donating more than he'd dared to hope for. His leather jacket was back home, replaced by a clean button-down shirt that still felt strange against his skin. Jack paused outside Sarah's room, taking a deep breath before knocking. The sound of her voice calling, "Come in," was stronger than he remembered. When he stepped inside, the change in Sarah was immediately noticeable. She was sitting up in bed, her hair neatly brushed and pulled back. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and though she still looked tired, her eyes were clearer and more alert. A half-eaten meal sat on the tray beside her bed. Actual food, not just the clear broth she'd been limited to before. "You're looking better," Jack said, setting the plant on her windowsill. "I'm feeling better," Sarah replied, watching as he adjusted the pot. "The doctors say my numbers are improving. They're actually talking about discharge plans now, though it'll still be a while." Jack pulled up the familiar chair beside her bed, its plastic surface worn smooth from countless visitors. "That's good news," he said, his gruff voice softening. "Maddie will be happy to hear it. She picked out the flowers, by the way." Sarah's face lit up at the mention of her daughter. "Purple's her favorite color," she said, looking at the small blooms. "She always knows exactly what I need." She paused, her fingers playing with the edge of her blanket. "Just like you did, with the fundraiser." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unused to praise. "The whole town helped," he mumbled. "But you made it happen," Sarah insisted. She reached out and touched his arm, the first time she'd initiated contact since he'd come back into her life. "Jack, I need to thank you properly. Not just for the money, but for taking care of Maddie, for being there when I couldn't be." Her touch was warm through his sleeve. and Jack found himself unable to pull away. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "After everything, after how I left things." "That was a long time ago," Sarah said softly. Her hand remained on his arm, a gentle pressure that seemed to anchor them both in the moment. "We were different people then. You've changed." Jack looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same kindness in her eyes that he remembered from their youth. But there was something else there, too. Understanding, perhaps, or forgiveness. The wall of hurt and anger that had stood between them seemed to thin, just a little. "We both have," he said finally. Sarah smiled, and for a moment the years of separation seemed to fade. They sat in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, casting warm light on the purple flowers. The steady beep of the heart monitor marked time, but it no longer seemed ominous. Instead, it was a reminder that Sarah was healing, that things were getting better. The autumn days grew shorter, but Jack's world felt bigger than ever. His once quiet house now echoed with the sound of Maddie's laughter as she visited after school. The kitchen counter, usually bare except for his coffee maker, now held grocery bags and homework assignments. Today, Jack stood in Sarah's driveway, holding onto the seat of a small purple bicycle. Maddie sat nervously on top, her hands gripping the handlebars so tight her knuckles were white. "Remember what I told you," Jack said, his voice gentler than anyone who knew his past would believe possible. "Keep your eyes forward, not down. I've got you." "Promise you won't let go?" Maddie asked, her feet finding the pedals. "Not until you're ready," he assured her. As he jogged alongside the bike, supporting it while Maddie pedaled, he caught sight of Sarah watching from the porch. She sat in a comfortable chair, wrapped in a warm blanket despite the mild weather, still recovering but getting stronger each day. The bike wobbled as Maddie found her rhythm. "That's it," Jack encouraged. "You're doing great, kid." Her confidence grew with each rotation of the pedals, and soon she was grinning, the wind pushing her hair back. After the bike lesson, Jack tackled the broken step on Sarah's back porch. The wood had rotted, through, making it dangerous. As he worked, sawing and measuring, Maddie sat nearby, doing her homework, and occasionally asking him questions about math problems. Inside the house, the smell of Sarah's cooking filled the air. She'd insisted on making dinner, even though Jack had offered to order takeout. "I've been sitting around long enough," she'd said firmly. "Let me do this." Later that evening, after Maddie had gone to bed, Jack and Sarah sat on the newly repaired back porch. The night air was cool, crickets chirping in the darkness. Sarah had brought out 2 mugs of tea, and Jack held his awkwardly, unused to drinking anything that wasn't coffee or beer. "You're good with her," Sarah said quietly. "Maddie, she talks about you all the time now." Jack stared into his mug. "She makes it easy. She's a good kid." "She is." Sarah wrapped her hands around her own mug. "You know, I was so angry at you for so long. When you left, when you chose that life over everything else, I thought I'd never forgive you." Jack's shoulders tensed, but he forced himself to stay still, to listen. "But watching you with Maddie, seeing how you've changed," Sarah continued, her voice soft but steady. "I realized that holding on to that anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you." "I didn't deserve forgiveness," Jack said roughly. "Still don't." "Maybe that's not for you to decide." Sarah turned to look at him. "We can't change the past, Jack, but we can choose how we move forward." The cricket songs filled the silence between them. Jack thought about the past weeks, the bike lessons, the grocery runs, the quiet moments of simply being there. Each small act had felt like placing a stone in a wall, rebuilding something he thought was permanently broken. "I'm trying," he said finally. "To be better. To make things right." Sarah reached over and placed her hand on his arm, just as she had in the hospital. "I know you are. That's what matters." They sat together in the growing darkness, their tea growing cold, but neither moved to go inside. The weight of old hurts seemed to lift slightly with each passing moment, like clouds gradually clearing after a storm. The Thunder Road bar sat on the outskirts of town, its neon sign buzzing in the late afternoon sun. Jack's boots crunched on the gravel parking lot as he approached the weathered building. His old leather jacket felt tight across his shoulders. He hadn't worn it in months. Inside, the bar was dark and smoky. A few early patrons hunched over their drinks, but Jack's attention went straight to the back corner. 3 men sat at a round table, their leather vests decorated with faded patches. They looked up as Jack approached, their expressions a mix of surprise and wariness. "Well, look who's back from the dead," said Mike, the largest of the 3. His gray beard reached his chest, and his arms were covered in tattoos that had long since lost their sharp edges. "Hey boys," Jack said, pulling up a chair. The wooden seat creaked under his weight. "Heard you've gone soft," said Danny, the youngest of the group. His fresh-looking tattoos and bright bandana marked him as newer to the life. "Something about helping some woman and her kid?" Jack met Danny's challenging stare. "That's right." "The Jack Reynolds I knew wouldn't be playing house," Mike said, taking a long drink from his beer. "What happened to you, man?" The bartender brought Jack a glass of water. He'd asked for it when he came in. That alone raised eyebrows around the table. Jack took a slow sip before answering. "Found something worth changing for," he said simply. "Just like that?" Tommy, the 3rd man, spoke up. His voice was raspy from years of cigarettes. "After everything we've been through?" Jack looked at each of his old friends in turn. These men had been his family once, had ridden with him through good times and bad. They'd shared the road, shared battles, shared secrets that would never see daylight. "Nothing just like that about it," Jack said. "Been a long time coming. Just needed the right reason." "And this woman and her kid, they're the right reason?" Mike leaned forward, his expression serious. "Yes." The simple word hung in the air. Danny scoffed and muttered something under his breath, but Mike held up a hand to silence him. "You really mean that, don't you?" Mike studied Jack's face. "Never thought I'd see the day." "People can change," Jack said. "Sometimes they need to." "And what about the Brotherhood?" Danny demanded. "That mean nothing now?" Jack turned his water glass slowly. "It meant everything once, but I'm not that man anymore." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words and shared history. Finally, Mike nodded slowly. "Well, hell," he said. "If Jack Hells Reynolds can change..." He raised his beer bottle. "Maybe there's hope for all of us." Tommy raised his glass, too, though Danny just sat back with his arms crossed. Jack lifted his water, and they clinked glasses. The gesture felt like both a farewell and a blessing. As Jack walked out of the Thunder Road bar, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. His old leather jacket didn't feel as uncomfortable anymore. Or maybe he'd just made peace with what it represented. His motorcycle was parked at home. He'd driven his truck instead. Another small change, another step toward the man he was becoming. The drive home was quiet, and Jack felt lighter with each mile. He'd faced his past today, looked it in the eye, and chosen his new path without hesitation. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace with who he was and where he was going. The evening air was crisp and clean after the recent rain. Jack and Sarah sat on his front porch, the wooden chairs creaking softly beneath them. Steam rose from their coffee mugs as they watched Maddie chase fireflies in the yard, her laughter echoing across the quiet street. "She's different now," Sarah said softly, wrapping her hands around her mug. "Happier. I haven't seen her this carefree in a long time." Jack nodded, his eyes following Maddie as she darted between the trees. "Kids are resilient that way. Give them a chance and they bounce right back." Sarah turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed too, you know. The Jack I knew before would never have sat here drinking coffee and watching the sunset." "The old Jack was an idiot," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "Wasted a lot of years running from the wrong things." "And now?" Sarah asked. "What are you running toward?" Jack was quiet for a moment, considering her question. The porch light cast a warm glow around them, and moths danced in its beam. "Not running anymore," he finally said. "First time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. Her touch was warm from the coffee mug. "I never thought we'd be here," she admitted. "After everything. When you showed up at the hospital, I was so angry. You had every right to be. Maybe. But you proved me wrong. You showed up every day, helped with the bills, took care of Maddie." She paused, watching her daughter twirl in the yard. "You became the man I always knew you could be." Jack felt his chest tighten with emotion. "Still trying to make up for lost time?" "We all are," Sarah said, "but maybe that's okay. Maybe we needed all that time apart to appreciate what we have now." In the yard, Maddie had stopped chasing fireflies and was gathering wildflowers that grew along the fence. Her small hands carefully selected each bloom, creating a makeshift bouquet. "What happens now?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled, her eyes still on Maddie. "We keep building this, whatever this is, day by day." "Together?" "Together," she confirmed, squeezing his hand again. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as Maddie finished gathering her flowers. The sky had turned a deep purple, and the fireflies were out in full force now, creating a magical display in the gathering darkness. Maddie turned toward the porch, her face lit up with excitement. She clutched her wildflower bouquet tightly as she ran toward them, her shoes leaving small prints in the dewy grass. When she reached the steps, she bounded up them with the endless energy of childhood. She stopped in front of Jack, her eyes bright and earnest. The flowers in her hand were a mix of dandelions and small purple blooms, slightly crushed from her tight grip. Looking up at him with complete trust and affection, she smiled broadly. "You're like my daddy now," she said simply, holding out the bouquet to him. Jack's heart swelled in his chest, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The simple words from this small girl had more power than any he'd ever heard before. Jack stood at his kitchen window, watching the snow fall in thick, lazy flakes. His reflection in the glass caught his eye, and for a moment he studied the face looking back at him. The same beard, the same tattoos peeking above his collar, but something was different. The hard lines around his mouth had softened, and his eyes no longer held that defensive wariness. He touched the window, his rough fingers tracing the frost patterns that decorated the glass. 6 months ago, he would have been alone in this house, nursing old grudges and avoiding any hint of human connection. Now, the sound of Christmas carols drifted from the living room, where Sarah and Maddie were decorating the tree. "Jack!" Maddie's voice called out. "We need help with the star." He smiled, something that came easier these days. Moving away from the window, he walked into the living room. The smell of pine needles and cinnamon filled the air. Sarah was untangling a string of lights, her hair falling across her face as she worked. Maddie stood by the tree, holding a golden star that was almost as big as her head. "I can't reach the top," Maddie explained, bouncing on her toes, "even with the stool." "Well, we can't have a Christmas tree without a star, can we?" Jack moved closer, bending down. "How about a lift?" Maddie's eyes lit up. She climbed onto his shoulders, giggling as he stood carefully. Sarah watched them, her hands stilling on the lights, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Steady now," Jack said, holding Maddie's legs as she reached out with the star. Her small tongue poked out in concentration as she worked to place it perfectly. "There," she announced triumphantly. "It's perfect." Jack lowered her back to the ground, and they all stepped back to admire their work. The tree twinkled with white lights, ornaments catching and reflecting the glow. Some were store-bought, but many were handmade, paper chains and painted pine cones that Maddie had created with painstaking care. "Hot chocolate?" Sarah suggested, heading toward the kitchen. "I think we've earned it." Jack watched her go, remembering how different things had been when she was in the hospital. The fear, the uncertainty, the mountain of bills that had seemed insurmountable. Now, here they were, celebrating Christmas together. Maddie tugged at his sleeve. "Can we put out cookies for Santa?" "It's still morning, kiddo," he chuckled, "but we can bake some later." Sarah returned with 3 steaming mugs, passing them around. They settled on the couch, Maddie squeezed between them. The room was warm and bright, filled with the kind of comfort Jack had never thought he'd experience. "Look," Maddie pointed to the window. "The snow's getting heavier." They watched together as the world outside turned white, the flakes dancing in the winter light. Jack felt Sarah's hand find his behind Maddie's back, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, soft enough that only he could hear. Jack squeezed her hand gently. He didn't need to ask what she was thanking him for. The answer was all around them. In the decorated tree, in Maddie's happy chatter, in the 3 stockings hanging from the mantel. Maddie began singing along with the Christmas music playing softly in the background, her voice clear and sweet. Sarah joined in, and after a moment's hesitation, so did Jack. His deep voice wasn't particularly musical, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were together, a family celebrating their first Christmas in a home filled with love and laughter. The evening settled around them like a gentle blanket as Jack and Sarah sat at the kitchen table. The dishes from Christmas dinner were done, and Maddie had fallen asleep on the couch, worn out from the day's excitement. A small lamp cast a warm glow over them, making shadows dance on the walls. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, running her finger along the rim of her tea mug, "about what happens next." Jack leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. The sleeve of his sweater rode up, showing the edge of an old tattoo. Once, it had been a symbol of his wilder days. Now it was just a reminder of how far he'd come. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he had a feeling he knew. Sarah took a deep breath. "Maddie needs stability, a real home. And after everything that's happened..." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've seen how good you are with her, how much you've changed." Jack's throat tightened. "I'm not the same person I was before. That guy who ran with the bikers, who pushed everyone away. He's gone." "I know," Sarah said softly. "I see it every day. The way you help her with homework, how you taught her to ride that bike, even when she fell a dozen times." Through the doorway, they could see Maddie curled up under the Christmas tree's twinkling lights. Her face was peaceful, one hand still clutching the stuffed bear Jack had given her that morning. "I want to do right by her," Jack said. "By both of you. I know I can't erase the past, but I can make sure the future is better. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. Her touch was warm, familiar now in a way that felt like coming home. We could make this official, she suggested. Move in together properly. Give Maddie the family she deserves. Jack squeezed her hand. You sure about that? Taking on an old biker as part of the package deal? Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. That old biker saved us. Besides, I think we've all seen who you really are under all that leather and those tattoos. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the Christmas lights and Maddie's gentle breathing from the other room. I never thought I'd have this, Jack admitted. A family, a real home. Always figured my past would keep me from having anything good. The past is just that. Past, Sarah said firmly. What matters is who you choose to be now. And you've chosen to be someone Maddie can look up to, someone I can trust. Jack stood up, still holding Sarah's hand. Come on, he said. Let's go sit on the porch for a bit, just like old times. They grabbed their coats and stepped outside. The night was crisp and clear, and fresh snow was starting to fall. They settled onto the porch swing, Sarah tucking herself against Jack's side. The snow drifted down silently, covering everything in a clean, white blanket. It was as if nature itself was helping them start fresh, covering the old with something new and pure. Jack looked at their joined hands, at the house behind them where Maddie slept peacefully, at the life they were building together. For the first time in more years than he could count, he felt completely at peace. This was home, not just the building, but the feeling of belonging, of being exactly where he was meant to be. Spring brought new life to their little corner of town. The snow had melted away, leaving behind fresh grass and budding flowers around Jack's, now their home. The house itself had transformed, just like its occupants. Cheerful curtains hung in windows that once stayed dark, and children's toys dotted the yard where emptiness used to reign. Jack stood at the kitchen counter one morning, packing Maddie's lunch. He carefully wrapped her favorite sandwich, peanut butter and banana, just the way she liked it. Through the window, he could see Sarah tending to her new garden, the morning sun catching her hair. The sight made him pause, overwhelmed by how different his life had become. Did you remember to put in extra napkins? Maddie asked, appearing beside him in her school uniform. Her backpack was covered in cartoon characters, a stark contrast to the leather jacket hanging by the door. Extra napkins, just like always, Jack replied, tucking them into her lunchbox. And I added a surprise. Maddie's eyes lit up. What kind of surprise? You'll have to wait and see, he said, ruffling her hair. He'd slipped in her favorite chocolate chip cookies, the ones Sarah had baked yesterday. Sarah came in from the garden, dirt on her knees and a smile on her face. The tomatoes are coming in nicely, she announced, washing her hands at the sink. We'll have fresh ones for summer salads. Can I help plant more stuff after school? Maddie asked eagerly. Of course, sweetie, Sarah said, drying her hands. But first, you need to get to class. Jack grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. Ready for your first motorcycle ride to school, kiddo? Maddie bounced with excitement. They'd been practicing on weekends, short rides around the neighborhood with Sarah watching nervously from the porch. Now Maddie was ready for the real thing. Remember the rules, Sarah said, adjusting Maddie's helmet. Hold on tight to Jack, and no wiggling around. I know, Mom, Maddie said, practically vibrating with anticipation. Jack helped Maddie onto the bike, making sure she was secure behind him. The motorcycle was different now, too. Cleaned up, properly maintained, with a special seat modification for Maddie. It wasn't just a symbol of his old life anymore. It had become something new, something that brought joy instead of escape. "All set?" he asked, feeling Maddie's arms wrap tightly around his waist. "Ready," she called back, her voice muffled by the helmet. Sarah stood in the doorway, trying to hide her worry behind a smile. Jack gave her a reassuring nod. He would protect their daughter with his life. The motorcycle rumbled to life, and Jack felt Maddie squeeze tighter with excitement. As they pulled away from the house, he heard her delighted laugh carried on the morning breeze. They cruised down the quiet streets, Maddie's giggles mixing with the gentle purr of the engine. Other parents turning into the school parking lot did double takes at the sight of them. The big, tattooed man on a motorcycle with a little girl in a school uniform. But Jack didn't mind anymore. He knew who he was now, not just the former biker, but a father figure, a partner, a man who had found his way home. They pulled up to the school entrance, and Jack helped Maddie off the bike. She was beaming as she took off her helmet, her hair slightly mussed. "That was awesome," she exclaimed. "Can we do it again tomorrow?" Jack smiled, his heart full. "Every day if you want, princess." Jack sat on the porch steps in the late afternoon sun, watching the shadows stretch across the yard. The motorcycle was parked in the driveway, gleaming after its morning ride with Maddie. A child's bicycle lay on its side near the garden, evidence of the new life that had blossomed here. His fingers traced the faded tattoos on his arms, remnants of a different time. Each mark told a story of his past, but now they seemed like chapters in an old book, important parts of his journey, but no longer defining who he was. The sound of children playing drifted from a few houses down. It didn't bother him anymore, the noise that once would have sent him retreating inside. Instead, it reminded him of Maddie's laughter, of the joy she'd brought into his life. He remembered the day she'd first appeared on his porch, shivering in the snow. Back then, he'd been so guarded, so convinced that isolation was the only way to live. His house had been just like him, cold, uninviting, shut off from the world. Now there were flowers in window boxes, chalk drawings on the driveway, and a warmth that went beyond the physical. The screen door creaked behind him, and Sarah's familiar footsteps approached. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Her presence was comfortable now, natural in a way he'd never thought possible. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, bumping his shoulder gently. Jack smiled, something that came easier these days. "Just thinking about how different everything is, how different I am." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You know, when Maddie first told me she'd found help at the house of the scary motorcycle man, I nearly had a heart attack." She chuckled softly. "But she saw something in you that day. Something good." She saw past all this, Jack gestured to himself, the tattoos, the leather vest, the rough exterior. "Straight through to whatever was left of my heart." "Children have a way of doing that," Sarah said, "of finding the truth in people." Jack thought about the morning's ride to school, how completely he'd transformed from the man who once pushed everyone away. Now his days were filled with packed lunches, bedtime stories, and endless questions about everything under the sun. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "A family. A purpose beyond just existing." Sarah reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. The simple gesture still amazed him. How easy it was now to accept affection, to let someone close. "You were always capable of this, Jack," she said. "You just needed to believe it, yourself." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. The garden Sarah had planted was starting to bloom, patches of color dotting the earth where there had once been only weeds. Like the garden, They had grown together, turning something neglected into something beautiful. The peace he felt in this moment was different from the artificial quiet of his old solitary life. This was real peace, the kind that came from knowing you were exactly where you were meant to be, with the people you were meant to be with. Sarah squeezed his hand gently, and Jack squeezed back, grateful for second chances and the unexpected ways life could change when you opened your heart to possibility. Jack sank into his old leather armchair, the one that had been his sole companion for so many years. The evening light filtered through the curtains Sarah had hung last month, soft, cream-colored things that made the room feel warmer somehow. His eyes drifted over the changes. In his living room, Maddie's drawings taped to the walls, family photos on the mantel, and Sarah's books stacked neatly on the coffee table. The house didn't feel empty anymore. The silence that once echoed through these rooms had been replaced by the gentle hum of life, the distant sound of Sarah humming in the kitchen, the soft padding of Maddie's feet upstairs as she worked on her homework. His gaze fell on a framed photo nearby. It showed the three of them at the school fair last month, Maddie perched on his shoulders, cotton candy in hand, while Sarah leaned against him, laughing at something out of frame. The man in that photo, with his genuine smile and relaxed posture, was almost unrecognizable from the person he'd been just a year ago. The old leather jacket he'd worn like armor hung by the door, next to Maddie's pink raincoat and Sarah's sweater. It was just a jacket now, not a shield. He didn't need it to keep people at arm's length anymore. Through the window, he could see fresh snow starting to fall. It reminded him of that fateful day when a shivering little girl showed up on his porch, changing his life forever. Back then, he'd seen the snow as a barrier, another way to isolate himself from the world. Now it made him think of warm cocoa, family movie nights, and weekend sledding adventures with Maddie. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Hot chocolate?" she asked, knowing his answer before he spoke. He nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. These simple moments, these daily rituals they'd created together, meant everything to him now. The sound of footsteps thundering down the stairs announced Maddie's arrival. "Mom! Dad! Look outside!" she exclaimed, pressing her face against the window. She'd started calling him Dad a few months ago, and each time she did, it still filled his heart with joy. "It's really coming down," Sarah observed, moving to stand behind their daughter. "Looks like we might have enough for snowmen tomorrow." Jack rose from his chair, feeling none of the weariness that used to weigh him down. "Why wait until tomorrow?" he suggested, earning an excited squeal from Maddie. They bundled up together, Maddie in her purple snow boots, Sarah wrapping a scarf around her neck, Jack pulling on his gloves. As they stepped outside onto the porch, the snow fell silently around them, coating everything in a pristine white blanket. Maddie twirled in the falling snow, her face turned up to the sky, catching snowflakes on her tongue. Sarah slipped her hand into Jack's, leaning against his shoulder. The three of them stood there, watching the transformation of their world into something magical and new. Jack pulled them both closer, feeling the warmth of their embrace despite the cold air. This was his family now, not just people sharing a house, but souls connected by love, trust, and the journey they'd taken together. The path to redemption had led him here, to this moment, to these people who had helped him discover the best version of himself. As the snow continued to fall softly around them, Jack felt a profound sense of peace. He was exactly where he needed to be, with exactly who he needed to be with. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility, and for the first time in his life, he was ready to embrace it all. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story, and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.